I grew up in a small town on the southern edge of Missouri. It wasn't a very large town by any means, but it had everything one would need to survive. A post office, a drugstore, a handful of shops, a grocery store, and even a small movie theater. A lot of people would probably hate to live in a small town, but I didn't mind it. I had a few friends, and I knew almost everyone who lived there by name. My father worked in the post office, and my mother worked from home. She was a technical consultant for some corporation out of state. If I had to describe my town with one word, that word would be simple. Nothing of any significance ever happened in my town. The most notable things that I can remember is one year my neighbor had his trash can stolen by what we all assumed was a bear, though it has yet to be recovered. Another year, a lady who lives just up the road from us won the lottery, a whopping $1,200. She was really the talk of the town for a few weeks. But 4 years ago, something strange happened to my town, and everyone I've spoken to since couldn't seem to remember it. Once I turned 21 years old, my parents did something incredibly unexpected. They gave me their house. The house itself was just your average run-of-the-mill home, nothing fancy. My parents had paid off the majority over the years, and once I finished college and had a steady job, they asked me if I'd be willing to take over the payments. My parents had been talking about retiring to Florida for years, and once I was finally able to live within my means, they made the offer. I was ecstatic, to say the least. While the thought of spending more of my life in this town disappointed me somewhat, the thought of being a homeowner at such a young age was exciting. My dad told me that if I wanted to sell the house that I could, though the thought hadn't even crossed my mind. During that year, I helped my family pack up most of their belongings, and they headed to their new home in the retirement capital of the US. The first few weeks were amazing. I loved the freedom of doing whatever I wanted in my new home. After the first month, however, the sudden realization of bills hit me like a ton of bricks. Even though most of it had been paid off, the utilities as well as any additional expenditures quickly piled on. Adjusting to living on my own definitely needed some getting used to. I had to pick up extra hours at my job just to get by. One night, after getting home late from work, I lazily stumbled through my front door and fell face first onto my couch. I turned on the television so I could have a little bit of background noise while I drifted off. Only, what I heard on the TV captured my attention. A local news announcer said that a strange storm was heading in the direction of our town. He didn't say what type of storm it was, only that we should all remain indoors and that we shouldn't attempt to go outside regardless of what we see. I thought that was an odd way to describe a storm, but I thought nothing of it and drifted off to sleep. When I awoke, there was darkness. The alarm I had set my phone to go off at 8 a.m. rang violently in my pocket. I sat up and noticed that my windows looked like they had a black sheet hung on the outside of it. Inside my house was almost as dark, but I could still make out the vague shapes of my furniture. I walked over to my window and stared out of it, unable to make anything out aside from the dirty glass that I was looking through. I tried to call my boss to see if he was experiencing the same thing, since I had to be at work in an hour. When I called him, I was greeted with an endless busy signal. I grabbed my jacket and made my way to the door. I'm not sure why, but when I grabbed the handle, something in the pit of my stomach told me not to open it. So I didn't. I sat back down on my couch and tried the TV, hoping that there was some more information on this strange phenomenon. I wasn't so lucky. My TV only produced static, which seemed to struggle as it tried to light up the living room. I waited for a few hours, and the darkness only persisted. It was around the 6th hour mark that I began to hear things coming from outside. Muffled screams in the distance. People crying out for help before quickly going silent. I wasn't sure what I should do. Then, I heard someone right on the other side of my window shouting for someone to come help them. I made my way over to the glass hoping to see something, but it was useless. While I was pressing my face against the glass in my attempts to see anything, something slammed against the window, causing me to fall backwards. I'm not sure what hit the window, as I still couldn't see anything on the other side. I scrambled to my bedroom and locked the door behind me. I tried dialing the police, but was once again met with a busy tone. A few more hours passed, and I tried to keep my sanity by reading a book, with the use of one of my desk lamps pressed closely to the pages. I was just trying my best to wait it out, hoping it was just like any other storm and would soon pass. Then, I heard a knock on my door. My back door. I got up from my desk with a baseball bat in hand, and slowly crept over to my door. The closer I got, the louder the knocks became until I was face to face with the door itself. The knocking stopped. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No one responded. I then called out that I had a gun and was willing to use it, even though that was a lie. Still, no response. After waiting for a few moments, I decided that I had gone insane and was now hearing strange noises. As soon as I turned my back to the door, the knocking turned to pounding. This sent me into a sprint back to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door once again behind me. I huddled myself in the corner of my room with my bat in hand, and though I tried to stay awake and on guard, my tiredness got the better of me. I awoke on the floor of my bedroom with the bat still clutched in one hand. Only this time, light was now shining through my window. That's what had woken me up in the first place. I rapidly sat up, and the first thing I did was check my phone. A new day had arrived and I had somehow slept for 12 hours. I checked all the local news sites, but what I saw confused me. There were no mentions of anything out of the ordinary for the previous day. I scrolled and scrolled, but nothing had been posted. I called my boss to ask him about yesterday, and he was upset that I just skipped an entire day of work without letting anyone know. I walked outside my house and looked around. My entire neighborhood looked just as normal and boring as it always had. I was starting to think that I must have just imagined all of it. That was until I walked around to the back of my house. My entire back door was completely scratched up. Long gashes ran along the wood, almost as if a wild animal had been scraping away at it. The fact that it was still standing was beyond me. Over the next few days, I started to notice other small things wrong with the town, which ultimately led to me selling the house and moving out of state. A few of my neighbors' houses had recently become vacant. I remember each and every person who lived in those houses. But whenever I asked someone about it, I'm always told they had always been empty. I tried searching for the missing people in phone books and online, but their names never pop up anywhere in the whole state. After that, I sold the house and moved to a more populated town in Illinois. Over the years, I have just tried to forget about the strange incident that occurred 4 years ago. I'm not sure where that darkness came from, or what was lurking within it. I have no idea where my neighbors disappeared to, nor why nobody seems to remember it happening. The only reason I'm bringing it up once again is that I just turned on the TV, and an announcer is saying a strange storm is moving into our area soon, and that we should all stay indoors. So if any of you out there happen to see the same broadcast, get out of town before you end up like one of the people that everyone else forgot. I'm not really sure where to begin, as I'm not much of a writer, but I'll try my best. My name is Jack, and I grew up in a small town just outside Indianapolis. My father was a decent, hardworking man. He was a factory worker most of his life. He always liked to joke around with me, pointing to different cars driving by and saying, "Hey, did you know I built that one?" It was fun for the first 100 times, but he was relentless. My mother, on the other hand, she was a banker. She liked to joke that she was a millionaire, but only at work. My parents were a match made in heaven, I suppose. Growing up, my life was as cookie cutter as life could be. I didn't have a lot of friends, just a few close ones who I hung out with constantly. I never got into any trouble, never did drugs, and never missed a day of school. I was that perfect child parents always dreamed of having. While some of my friends did get themselves into mischief sometimes, I was always that kid who never went with them. Sure, it cost me some friendships, and people eventually stopped inviting me to do things, but none of that really mattered to me. After graduating high school, my father wanted me to go into the factory business, but I was never very good with manual labor. I was more of a technical guy. Hand me a computer over a wrench any day. Even though he was mildly disappointed at hearing this, he was still very supportive. I went to college and got a bachelor's degree in accounting. To some of you, that might sound as the stupidest degree someone could get. But for my whole life, I've always been good with numbers, and there's always a need for someone to process those numbers. Someone may look at it and see stupid. I look at it and see job security. Though I must agree, my job is extremely boring. Not long after graduating college, I had a job offer from a corporation in the city, processing audits and the like. It wasn't a very good job, and the long hours made me cringe, but the pay was great. That's what it all comes down to in the long run, I guess. Money. I accepted, and for the better part of the last 6 years, I've been working there. My life hardly got more exciting after I started working there. The most exciting thing I've ever done was move into a house. It was a really nice place. Cozy. And on the complete opposite side of the city from my job. Commuting to work and back was nightmarish, but there wasn't much else I could do. So every single day, for years, I would wake up extra early in the morning, shower, shave, get dressed, drink coffee, and drive 45 minutes to my mundane job. Every single day for 2 years straight, this repetition has been my whole life. Then, one day, something happened. It was an overcast morning, and for some reason my alarm didn't go off. So right from the very beginning, I was already having a pretty crappy day. As I scrambled to get ready, I nicked my chin with my razor, and I spilled coffee all over my brand new shirt and tie. I dashed outside, threw my briefcase into my car, started it up and drove away. For about 3 minutes. The horrendous clunk under the hood of my car rattled the interior, and I felt my heart sink with each thud. Shortly after, my car came to a rolling stop only a few houses away from my own. I rested my head on my steering wheel, regretting ever getting out of bed this day. As I resigned myself to walking to the bus stop, I stepped out of my car and onto the sidewalk. Just as I did, a young boy came running past me. He tripped on the pavement and landed face first on the concrete. Shocked, I ran over to the boy and helped him up. His face had minor scrapes on it, and I asked him if he was all right. It was then that he said something to me, and it's the reason I'm writing this story in the first place. The look in the boy's eyes were vacant, like he was in some sort of trance. It was as if he were looking through me. He said, 4 years from today, your death will come. I could only blink in response as I stared at the boy. A moment later, who I assumed was his mother came rushing out of a nearby house. She gave me an accusatory glare, and it was at that moment that I realized I was a grown man holding and talking to a small boy who wasn't my son. I quickly backed away and told the mother that he tripped and I was helping him up, though that didn't seem to make things better. I apologized to her and walked away. But then the boy said another thing that gave me a moment of pause. He said, "Goodbye, Jack." I froze in mid-step. When I looked over my shoulder, the boy looked to his mother, smiled, laughed, and ran off back towards his house. Entering my own house, I called my work and requested some time off. They didn't mind, as I had never even taken a sick day up until now. I spent a few weeks racking my brain on how that boy knew my name and what he had said earlier. Then I spent another few weeks trying to just forget the whole incident ever happened. I wrote that day off as just a really bad day and tried to put it behind me. Over the years since, my life once again resumed its mundane repetition. I take that back. I did get a promotion at my job, so I was now head supervisor of the accounting department, which was just a fancy title for slightly more pay and even more outrageous work hours. 3 years is quite a long time, and had you asked me about that day, I probably wouldn't have fully remembered it. That was until last month. I was awoken in the middle of the night. There was no reason for my sleep to have been disturbed, as I heard no sounds and saw no one around me. I just opened my eyes at 3 a.m., fully awake. I got out of bed to get a glass of water from the kitchen. While I gulped down the glass, something caught my eye through the kitchen window. It was only for a moment, but it looked like somebody was standing outside my house, in the dark. I called the police simply because it was better safe than sorry. The operator told me they would send a car up and down my block, but that was the best they could do unless something else happened. I thanked them and hung up. I went back to bed without issue. And the next morning, while I sipped my coffee, I went to check for my morning paper. That's when I saw it. A letter taped to my door. It only said one thing: "Your time is almost up." Standing there, I could barely hear my mug shatter on the ground. Instantly, I was brought back to that day with that kid, and what he had said to me. 1,000 questions raced through my head. Was the kid still messing with me? Was this just some sick joke? Why would someone make a joke go on this long? I backed away from the door and checked my calendar. Even though I previously had trouble remembering the whole ordeal, with this sudden jog of my memory, I remembered the day specifically. It was only 1 month away. Ever since receiving that notice, I've called the police and reported it as a death threat, though I couldn't understand why anyone would target me. I've never done anything remarkable in my life. I've never hindered or hurt anyone. I've never let myself get close enough to anyone to hurt them. The police told me once again there wasn't much they could do, and I hated them for telling me that. The last few weeks after receiving that letter has been mental hell for me. I can hardly sleep. I don't leave my house for any reason. I know it's probably just a hoax, but I can't shake the what if from my mind. I've called my family and remaining friends, telling them all how much I love them. I've written out a will, though I don't even own that much, so it's probably not that important. I told my job that I needed some more time off, though I can tell they're getting antsy over me missing so much work. Tomorrow is supposedly the day. Looking back on my life, I've done absolutely nothing with it. I've never traveled. I've never had a relationship lasting longer than a few months. I've never experienced a whole lot of new things. I never lived. If I'm right and my last day on Earth is tomorrow, I will die with so many regrets. But if I'm wrong and I survive, there is so much I plan on doing. My advice: and potential last words to every single one of you listening to this. Live. Live your lives as if they were going to end very soon. Explore the world. Fall in love, fall out of love. Eat new foods. And be the best person you can be. If not, you might regret it. Just like I do. I don't know what that boy was, or if I had wronged someone in the past. But I just want to say, if I don't survive tomorrow, then I am sorry. Sorry for not cherishing life as much as I should have. I've been told this is the place to post mysterious stuff and to get answers. Which is good because answers are what I need right now. So I live in one of those older suburban developments outside of Toronto. You know, the ones they built up in the 70s for the poorer people to move into. I've lived at that house for my entire life. And yes, that includes my childhood. Growing up in the early 2000s with rather frugal parents, my childhood memories were of watching movies on VHS, playing games on Windows XP, and so on. Of the many movies I remember watching as a young boy, one of them was certainly not Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls. I discovered the obscure film when I was cleaning out the basement. My parents had moved out some time ago and left me the old house. They wanted me to make one last check for anything they might want to bring to their new house. When I was searching the basement, I found a box in the corner of the room labeled Kids Movies. I opened it and began to look at some of the VHS tapes. Most of them I had fond memories of. VeggieTales, Peter Pan, the Berenstain Bears. Some I just found weird as a child. Like those obscure Christian films like Bible Man. Out of all these tapes, only one really stuck out to me as unfamiliar. The aforementioned Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls. According to the back of the case, it was made in 1992 by a Canadian film studio called Funbox Entertainment. Odd. Most of the cassettes I had were from the late 90s, around the time my older brother was born. Intrigued, I read the synopsis. From the studio that brought you Frankie Pig's Big Adventure, Canada's favorite farm friend is back in a feature-length adventure. When Farmer Casey lets the farm animals go on vacation, troublemaking Frankie Pig decides to jump ship in Niagara Falls, making friends and learning lessons as he tries to find Farmer Casey and the others. Alright. Sounds innocent enough, I thought to myself. Fortunately, I keep a VCR in the house in case I ever want to feel nostalgic. So I decided to find out what I was missing and loaded the tape into the machine. So first, it starts with the production company logo shining on the screen to that generic sort of synth music. Then another logo for a different company that did the distribution, called Kidscape Distribution Canada. After the logos, the film began with, surprisingly enough, a live-action sequence. Here on the live-action, but obviously cheaply made farm, we were all introduced to Farmer Casey, a friendly country gal who runs Fiddlesticks Farm. She loudly announces to the camera that she's taking the animals on a vacation, and you, the viewer, needs to help her wake them up. One by one, very slowly, we are introduced to the animated animals. Cassidy the cow, Elizabeth the horse, Larry the chicken, and Quincy the duck. But where's Frankie? Given what we know from the synopsis, the pig was up to no good. So Farmer Casey once again gives us, the viewer, the all-important duty of finding Frankie. And of course we do. He's hiding in the mud, silly pig. Now it's time for Farmer Casey to load the trailer and to disembark on our vacation. We make a few stops at some Canadian landmarks, where we then learn some basic information at each stop. Then, Frankie turns to the camera and tells us he's ditching the crew when we arrive to Niagara Falls because that farmer lady is just so boring. So we too join Frankie when he hops off the trailer when nobody's looking. And that's when everything changes. Immediately, the friendly-looking Frankie switches from a cute little pig with a hat to a real man with a distorted pig mask, and the camera quality became significantly distorted. I paused the tape. What the heck? I said to myself. I stopped watching for a little bit to do some research. I needed to find out what the hell this film was about. So I Googled it. Frankie Pig visits Niagara Falls. Nothing popped up. Nothing relevant anyway. Most of it was just some pictures of pigs on Instagram or something, some of which who happened to be named Frankie. So I then decided to look up the production company, Funbox Entertainment. Immediately I was presented with their website, so I clicked on it. The website was so obviously dated, with crappy vector graphics and pixelated GIFs of various animated characters, and the company motto, creating Canada's premier animation since 1972. There was a link to see all the movies they ever produced, and guess what? No mention of Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls, or Frankie Pig at all, for that matter. The most recent film they're credited with is an animated kids film, their specialty, entitled Horace's Lonely Island, made in 1991. However, there was a number to call at the bottom, so I did. No response. So I decided that before I did any more research, I would finish the film. I sat back down on the couch and pressed play. This new, creepy version retained the original childish voice of Frankie, except now it seemed like he was crying as he spoke, like he was forced to say the words. "Now that I've left those fools, it's time to explore," said Frankie. He was standing in a field, very obviously not a set. The camera turned to showcase the skyline of Niagara Falls, lit with nightlights. The film quality made it feel like those creepy found footage films on YouTube somewhere. The camera was behind Frankie, following him as we slowly walked towards the city. The film cut to Clifton Hill. It's practically midnight judging from the sky, and the lights of the strip are the only things cutting through the darkness. Frankie walks up the street, past several tour buses and tourists, none of whom seem to notice him. It's when he turns onto a side street when I notice he's holding something. A knife. A woman, dressed similarly to Farmer Casey, is standing at the end of the alley. When she turns around, her face is disfigured. "Frankie, you naughty pig, I thought I'd never find you," she hollered. The way she said it was eerie. Then, 4 men wearing animal masks appear behind her, and Frankie walks up to her. "I knew I'd find you, farmer lady," the child said on the other side of the microphone. Suddenly, the screen went static, and the camera cut to the film set at the farm. There, the 5 men brutally stabbed the actress who was playing Farmer Casey, while a young boy, who I think is the voice actor who played Frankie, watched. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Why would my parents even have this? I decided to stop watching again. What's the story of this strange film? There had to be some sort of explanation. So I did some more digging on the company, Funbox Entertainment. Turns out they declared bankruptcy in 1994 because they hadn't made money since '92. The same year Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls supposedly came out. Other than that, nothing was that out of the ordinary, just business stuff. Obviously, I was missing something. The opening credits mentioned another company, Kidscape Distribution Canada, the people who distributed the film to retailers. A quick search for them turned up their website, which showed that they were still distributing films. A phone number was provided here, so I called. The following is a rough transcription of what took place.
Hello, this is Chris from Kidscape Distribution of Greater Toronto. How may I help you today?
Hey Chris, I'd like to ask you some questions about one of the films you distributed.
Of course, which one?
It's this old VHS kids cartoon. I think it's called Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls.
Oh shit. I haven't heard of that one. If you leave your name and information, I'll get back to you when I can.
All right. I gave him my name and address before hanging up. The information I left him was fake, by the way. The way he acted over the phone was a bit too suspicious for my taste. Soon after, I went back to the tape and watched further. After the gruesome scene on set was finished, the scene jumped back to Niagara Falls, where the animals are now carrying the other woman who is dressed as Farmer Casey. They walk her back onto Clifton Hill when police lights begin to flare. Again, the camera cuts to a scene of the falls at daytime, and all seems normal until a hand appears in front of the camera, giving a thumbs up. Then, the body of the other woman is seen, being thrown into the falls. The camera is then spun around to reveal more establishing shots of the city, before a man starts singing children's nursery rhymes. It then resumes to the animated children's film I thought I would be watching. Frankie begins to regret leaving the other animals, and begins to take action to find Farmer Casey and the gang, while also learning about the history and significance of the city of Niagara Falls. Then the credits begin to roll, and this is when I got my notebook out. First and foremost, I needed to find out if the actor who portrayed Farmer Casey was ever murdered, the actor who portrayed Frankie was ever kidnapped, and if the director or someone at the studio ever got caught. But to my surprise, all of the names were cut out of the credits. This is when I went to the police. I drove over to the station and handed in the VHS and told them everything I knew. They told me they would do everything in their power to find out the meaning of this tape. So that's it, you're thinking. That's all. No, that's not all. Before I posted this, something came up on the news. Remember the fake address I gave to the distribution company? Yesterday, there was a fire at that very location. A fire the police suspect to be arson. I think I'm onto something here. If any of you out there have ever seen this movie, or know something about it, or have even worked on it, please tell me about it. I need to know everything about this film. Is it just my copy that's like this? Do the events on the film correlate to anything in Niagara Falls? Please, I just need to find some answers. I'm currently writing this from a hotel to serve as a warning to anyone that might be making a cross-country road trip. My wife and I were driving from Seattle to Wisconsin, and last night we ended up in the middle of nowhere. Due to the fact that my wife Kimmy and I both have a lack of any proper sleep schedule, meant that we decided to forego a hotel and just drive through the night, which, in hindsight, probably wasn't the best idea. There had been some construction going on the freeway, so we were required to take a detour. We ended up on State Road 200, a long, straight road with high hills and mountains on either side. It was one of those roads that seemed to stretch on endlessly for miles. As soon as we got on this road, the sun started to fall. Watching it drop seemed to cast the illusion that the road went on forever, into an endless abyss. The moon that had taken the sun's place was only a sliver in the sky, and we thought it was odd that there weren't many stars out. We hadn't seen another vehicle in at least 2 hours, and besides our eyes being relatively adjusted to the darkness, the only light we had was our car's headlights. After driving along for what felt like a few hours, we finally stopped at what was without question the sketchiest 24-hour gas station in the country. The entire experience there left me feeling like I needed to stop by a clinic on the way just to get tested. We finally hopped back on the road to continue our journey, but about 15 minutes later we heard something that sounded like a gunshot, followed by our front left tire wobbling off the rim, causing the car to dip down to the left. I quickly pulled off to the side of the road and we got out of the car. I went over to the rim to assess the damage and Kimmy just stood over me with the flashlight on her phone so I could see better. Out of habit, when I got out of the car, I had turned it off, and given that we were in the middle of nowhere, the only sounds surrounding us were cicadas and the trees swaying from the occasional gust of wind. That being the case, the sound of rustling coming from the hills a short distance to our left was quite apparent. Kimmy and I both looked across the street behind us, but the darkness was too thick, only allowing us to see the base of the hill and not much else. Kimmy and I weren't afraid of anything paranormal or anything like that. Our worries stemmed from the prospect of wild animals. Coyotes, bears, or wolves looking to satisfy their hunger. I quickly went back to getting the tire off, but a few moments later we heard it again. The rustling in the distance. It sounded like it was still a little ways off, so we turned back around and continued, picking up the pace a bit. I had just taken off the rim and the bolts were all collected in an empty McDonald's cup from earlier in our trip. I had turned to my side to grab the spare tire when we heard the sounds again, but this time we simply ignored them. And then, suddenly, the brightest light either of us had ever seen flooded the entire area around us. It was absolutely blinding. We both let out an audible "what the hell?" and shielded our eyes, trying to find the source of the illumination. My eyes adjusted just enough to see at least 3 massive flood lamps were spread across the hills aimed towards us. We were more confused than anything, because lights aren't really anything to be afraid of. I'm going to illustrate the following events as best as I can now. Kimmy must have noticed them first, because she whispered, "What is that?" And I squinted and strained my eyes, just barely making out some figures descending the hills towards us. They were just silhouettes in contrast to the bright light, just vague shapes of people trudging through tall grass, all spread out over maybe 25 yards. There was no house, no building, no structure from which the figures emerged, at least none that I could see. That's when I heard something behind us. I quickly whipped my head around and saw even more figures. These ones I was able to get a better look at. These figures weren't just silhouettes. They were fully visible in the sea of light. And it was infinitely more horrifying. They were dressed in what I can only describe as traditional hillfolk garb. Torn, filthy flannel, blue jean overalls, wide brim hats. One of them was stick thin, the next overweight, and so on. But it was their faces, or rather what they had over their faces, that truly made my heart sink into my stomach. They wore crudely made circular masks that I would only guess were made from paper plates. The faces on the white surfaces were scribbled on, and each one looked to be expressing a different emotion. I hope you can understand why I didn't just sit there and examine them. The entire situation had been going on for about 10 seconds at this point. I told Kimmy to get in the car, opening the driver's side door and all but shoving her in. As she crawled into the passenger seat and started the engine, I hastily maneuvered the spare tire on and spun 2 bolts about halfway as far as they could turn before I ran out of time. I yanked the car jack from its spot as hard as I could, dropping the front left of the car to the ground. As the people from our side of the street closed in, I hopped in the car and put it in drive. Instead of slamming on the gas as I feel anyone would want to do in that situation, I lurched forward in an attempt to keep the tire on, while still going fast enough to escape whatever the intentions of the hill people were. This lasted for maybe 35 yards before the spare tire couldn't handle it anymore and broke off the car. Our car thudded and screeched along the ground before coming to a dead stop. Kimmy and I got out of the car and began sprinting down the road. I looked back and saw that the hill people were now running after us. There must have been 15 of them spread all across the street. There wasn't really anything on either side of the road, just open land with the occasional tree and bordering hills. I don't even remember what I was thinking at that moment, but I know that both Kimmy and myself were given a boost of energy when a pair of headlights came into view from atop a hill directly down the road in front of us. I held my phone's flashlight up and waved it up and down in a sort of rudimentary SOS manner. It then occurred to me that whoever was in the car could have very well been one of them, but I figured that if that were the case, there was nothing more we could do about it, so I continued flashing the light at them. The hill people yelled behind us. It was all incomprehensible, but it definitely sounded threatening. Then, the approaching headlights flipped to their high beams. Kimmy and I started waving our arms wildly, hoping that this person would stop, praying that they would stop, or at the very least not run us over. We had about 20 yards between us and our pursuers when the car slowed. A man stuck his head out of the window as we sprinted to him and he yelled at us to get in. No doubt seeing the masked rednecks behind us, illuminated by his headlights. We both jumped into his back seat and he made a wide U-turn, almost driving into the ditch on the side of the road in the process. Kimmy and I looked behind us, and in the red glow that the taillights gave off, we saw our pursuer stop in the middle of the road, then slowly walk off the road in both directions, melting back into the darkness of those hills. The man who was driving the truck, his name was Matthew, and he absolutely saved our lives. If it wasn't for him, I probably wouldn't be able to write this story right now. We managed to get some service on our phones and called the police from the car, but we didn't stop driving until we got to the next gas station, which was about an hour from where our tire had blown. The gas station itself was closed, but it gave the police somewhere to meet us. They eventually arrived and asked us a bunch of questions. We told them everything that had happened, and after Kimmy's firm refusal to go back to the scene, they drove us to the nearest town and paid for a motel room for us. They also informed us that they would go back and retrieve our car with a tow truck and bring it here. We are finally safe now. They have an officer parked right outside our motel room, so I doubt anything else is going to happen. But before I end this, I wanted to mention that our car had arrived a few minutes ago, and I went out to check it out. Everything seemed to be fine apart from the missing tire. But upon closer inspection, I noticed something disturbing. Carved into the back of our trunk were 3 small words. We'll find you. I'm not sure how that's possible, but I know one thing. I just want to get the hell off this road and out of this damn state. So if any of you are planning on taking a road trip in the near future, please take my advice. Avoid State Road 200 through Montana at all costs. I work as a security guard for the happiest place on Earth, Disney World. Typically, I wouldn't say where I work, as obviously there are some pretty strict rules about things employees can put online, but I just don't think I could tell this properly without the context. And honestly, I think that this may be it for me anyways with this job. I just can't see myself working here any longer now. I've been with the company for 23 years. The first 20 years I worked in the parks, nabbing shoplifters and rounding up people who were drinking too much to combat the heat. Occasionally there'd be a fight to break up, but people usually kept it pretty mild. The heat and the walking was getting too much for me over the last few years. So I asked to be transferred somewhere with air conditioning, and the company moved me to one of their resorts. While the working conditions were 110% better as far as climate and comfort go, the guest issues were definitely trickier, mainly domestic. I guess the expense and stress of vacation got to a lot of people, and I'd be called by neighboring rooms because some mom and dad were yelling at each other all night. I'd try to suggest they take a nap or go do separate activities for a bit, and that would usually calm them down. But none of that is what I'm here for. I've got to get this out while I still have time. 3 days ago, I got a call from management. Apparently, a couple of days before that, housekeeping had gone into a room that should have been turned over for that day. Turned over is when one guest leaves at about 11 a.m., and the next guest checks in at around 3 p.m., and all of the guests' items were still in the room. Housekeeping made a note of it and moved on. But during the next 2 days when they entered the room again, everything was still there and untouched. I went to check it out, and sure enough, there was an empty room full of luggage, clothes, snacks, some toys, everything a family would need for a vacation. The manager had already looked up the previous reservation, and it was for a family: dad, mom, 2 little children. I tried to call the phone numbers they had given, but all I got was voicemail. We were all a bit stumped, so I made the call that the housekeeper could clean the room and take the family's personal items to be held until we got in contact with someone. I went digging into the reservation a bit more. The family had arrived 5 days before housekeeping discovered all their stuff. I found that the family had paid a parking fee and their vehicle description was listed. A quick walkthrough of the parking lots and I had easily located their vehicle. So that ruled out a car accident or them deciding just to leave all their stuff behind. Next, I saw that they had bought a dining plan. This is when a guest prepays for all their food. They're given a certain number of credits to use for meals. This family had only used 3 credits, and the last one was 2 days after they checked in. It appeared that the day they arrived, they got here pretty late, and probably just stayed on the resort. The next day, they used 2 credits at Epcot. The second park day, they used just 1 credit at Magic Kingdom, and it was at breakfast time. Now, at Disney, we have something called Magic Bands. Magic Bands are worn by the guests and act as a room key, park ticket, credit card, dining reservation payment, fast pass, a system used to bypass lines, and more. It took some work, but I was finally able to look up the family's fast pass history. The day they went to Magic Kingdom, they had breakfast at a restaurant in the park, rode a few rides, and then rode their last ride. It's a Small World, around 11 a.m. Then nothing. Finally, it was time to bring in someone else on this. I called an old coworker at Magic Kingdom and asked him to pull the security footage for It's a Small World at the time they wrote it, and I made my way over there. When I arrived, my friend was very confused, almost distraught looking. He showed me what he found. There's usually a camera in the direction of where the rides load and unload. The footage showed them scanning their bands to use fast passes for the ride and boarding it. The footage from the exit of the ride, however, just showed the other people in their car exiting. That family wasn't there. Of course, we all thought the worst. Maybe one of the kids had fallen out and mom and dad and the other kid got off in the middle of the ride to help, and they're all injured or killed or stuck in the machinery somewhere. So we shut down the ride, middle of the damn day. Turned off that earworm music and turned up the lights. My buddy and I walked that ride 3 times before we called in help. Eventually, there was close to 10 cast members searching, and we didn't find a damn thing except for 3 cell phones and a hat. I was completely baffled. I've kept digging over the past couple of days, and I'm not sure who to tell what I found next. I've called the police, and I suppose they're on their way. But the company has a way of covering up things like this. And I decided I can't live with myself if I don't put out some type of warning. I kept digging into their reservations over the last couple of days, and today I noticed that they had purchased Memory Maker. There are photographers all over the parks and cameras in a lot of the rides. And with Memory Maker, the photos are all free. They automatically get added to a guest's Disney account when the system knows their picture has been taken. And the system always knows. Everyone's whereabouts are always known with the magic bands. Well, I opened up their Memory Maker photo album, and I swear to God, there's 732 pictures. The first 30 or so are pretty normal. Epcot, a few rides in front of the castle. But the rest are all in It's a Small World. The rides only take 1 picture per go-around. So it appears as though this family has ridden this ride over 700 times. The first picture was pretty normal. Everyone looked happy. It was a busy day, and a full car of guests. The next one is rough to look at. The car is empty except for this family, and they look so confused. The next 10 to 15, I can see the dad getting angry and yelling. The mother is holding on to those 2 kids like her life depended on it. And you can see the kids getting increasingly upset and crying. And it goes on. And on. And on. After 50 or so, it looks like they're trying to get out. But in the very next one, they're all right back in that damn car. After around 450 or so, I only see the mom and kids. It's just when I look closely I can see the dad. Maybe just his body now, slumped down in one of the other seats. Since about 675, there's just mom and 1 kid. Another body in another seat. The mom and child aren't moving anymore. I think the 2 of them are still alive, just damn near catatonic, looking straight ahead, with pale faces. And guys, I swear to God on my life, the dolls of the ride are moving or something. In some of these pictures, I can tell they aren't where they should be. I even saw one with a doll in the car with the family. I can't look anymore or I think I'm gonna be sick. I closed the album. Its file size has increased since I closed it. Oh my God. Are there new pictures being added? I noticed on the security cameras that the local police department just arrived, so they'll take over soon. I just wish I knew what the hell was going on. But I also wish this damn thing had never landed in my lap. I don't think I'll be able to update this. After I talk to the police, I think I'm just going to walk out of here and never come back. I just wanted to get this out there, before Disney feeds the media some BS cover-up as to why the whole family vanished. But they didn't vanish. I know exactly where they are. About 3 weeks ago, I drove my son out to a national park for a little weekend camping trip. We took the 410 out from Tacoma into Mount Rainier, a place my own dad used to take me when I was a kid. I wanted my son, David, who's 2.5, to find the same joy of the wilderness that I had. But I'm quite convinced that he will be terrified of forests for the rest of his life. When we arrived that Friday, the weather was crisp and the first signs of spring had finally made themselves known. We walked, or rather, I walked with David on my shoulders for about 2, maybe 3 hours from the parking lot, into a small, desolate camping ground with a pre-made fire pit. I'm not a very overprotective parent, so I let David wobble around a bit while I set up the tent. Just as I was about done and getting ready to unload our 3-day supply into the tent, I heard David make some sounds from behind me. Now, I recognize these sounds immediately, as they are sounds he usually makes when he's excited about something. I turned around and saw him sitting in the grass, about 20 feet away, staring into the woods. Even more strangely, he was doing this thing he does when he's particularly excited about something, in which he slaps both of his legs repeatedly. I slowly walked over while trying to keep an eye on both him and the woods at the same time, but there was nothing in the tree line that I could make out. When I was finally by his side, I asked him what he had seen, and at this, his response was, "Monkey Man." He was smiling, still slapping his legs, and as much as I tried to match his excitement like a good parent should do, suddenly, the serenity of the woods was replaced by a sense of unease. I once again fixed my eyesight on the tree line and peered in very, very carefully. It was just such an incredibly strange thing for him to say. I picked David up, not wanting to leave him alone anymore, at least until I could regain some clarity, and walked into the tree line. I don't know how many of you are parents, but the last thing you want to do when you're taking your kid out for a fun weekend is to frighten them. I mention this because the sensible thing might have been to hush him, to tell him to keep quiet for a while. But then, I also knew that realistically, this was just an imaginative manifestation. After a few minutes of scouting around with David up on my shoulders, I decided to return to camp. It was about 3:30, I believe, so I made us some lunch, still keeping an occasional eye on the space at which David had been clapping and yapping just a few minutes before. As much as I tried to forget it, I just couldn't. I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in aliens, ghosts, or even Bigfoots. But I suppose my parental instinct was simply in too much of a high gear for me to let it go. So as the cold sun was setting, I decided to ask David a bit more about what he had seen. As I was getting the fire going, I asked him about the monkey man. I asked him if it was a big monkey man. David thought about it for a second. He then laughed and nodded. I then asked him if he seemed like a nice monkey man, and David once again giggled in approval. I wasn't really sure what else to ask. Nightfall struck, and on full bellies, I read a chapter from a book to him as he fell asleep in his sleeping bag. When I fell asleep myself, I had almost forgotten about the monkey man. I awoke in pitch darkness. The fire pit was out. I reached out to feel for David and panic struck me hard. He wasn't in the tent anymore. With only my underwear on, I stormed out but realized it was too dark to see anything. So I dropped back into the tent and tore my flashlight out of my bag. I was screaming his name all the while. With only the weak beam of a flashlight I didn't think I would ever have to actually rely on, I shone it around in circles, still calling out for David. For some reason, I ran towards the spot at which David had been so transfixed in the daytime. I shouted his name into the trees. As I trotted inwards into the pitch-black woods, I was too frantic to notice how badly my feet were getting scraped up by the bark and stone. After only about a minute of walking, I saw something that made me drop the flashlight and bolt forward. David was standing there, peering into the darkness, utterly still. I grabbed onto him hard, beginning to sob. Still clutching him tightly, I picked up the flashlight again, which had been idly beaming the ground, and looked around for a moment, fending off the darkness. I could see nothing around us. As I carried him back, looking over my shoulder, I asked what had happened. He replied that he didn't know, and that he was tired. David has sleepwalked before, so I was just chalking it up to that. That night, I locked up the tent from the inside with a padlock. I only got about 3 hours of good rest. David himself slept like a rock, despite my trembling embrace. The following morning, I cooked us some breakfast. David had no recollection of what had happened, and seemed content to continue the trip. I thought it would be careless to shrug off last night's event as mere sleepwalking, especially considering the monkey man business. But I also thought it would be a bit too silly to cancel the entire trip over it. Thus, I made a promise to myself that if anything else were to happen, we would drive back to Tacoma at a moment's notice. The rest of the day was actually quite nice, and helped me take my mind off of things. David was at first a little upset at not having the iPad, but eventually discovered that nature can be just as cool as pixels. We made some bark boats with faces on them and sent them downstream, watched some squirrels, listened to the birds. It was everything I had hoped the trip would be. At dusk, when the trees stretched long shadows across the grass, David was getting too cold and too tired to play anymore, so I decided we would spend the rest of the day in the tent. I had brought along this game where you have to trace the outline of a person with an electrode, and if your aim is off, it makes a funny sound, kind of like Operation. I don't remember what it was called, but David found it hilarious. It's a simple game, but supposedly helps develop motor skills. During one of David's turns, he made an error and the little speaker made the sound again, and David bellowed into laughter. What happened next filled me with a sense of fear that I doubt anything will ever match it. From about 50 feet away, I heard the exact same laugh that David had made, only it was much deeper. It was almost like when you record yourself speaking, then digitally pitch it down. I froze, and this time I couldn't hide my fear from David. I could tell by his face he had heard it too. I lifted my finger up to my lips to communicate to him that we needed to be quiet. It was at this moment that I also noticed that the sun had completely set. I also realized just how quiet the woods were. Every second felt like an eternal minute as we sat there in the tent, absolutely still, enveloped in a thick silence. When the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears finally ceased, I leaned over slowly towards my backpack to retrieve my handgun out of it. I never go into the woods without it. When I turned around to face David, I noticed that he had picked up the game again. I sternly removed it from his hand and whispered with equal sternness, "Not now, David." Then, just as I had said it, a low, broken voice whispered from literally inches from the tent,
"Not now, David."
The next thing I was aware of is that I was shooting through the fabric in the tent, in the direction of the sound. David was screaming, and as the gunshot rang throughout the woods, I heard the last remnants of something sprinting away. With my hand trembling violently, I opened the padlock and jumped out with a flashlight in my left hand, aiming the faint beam into black nothingness. I grabbed David, stuffed everything within arm's reach into the backpack, and ran. The way back was pure terror. There was not a second at which I did not feel as if something was right behind us, ready to leap out from behind us, or the side of the trail, out from the darkness. The only thing I could say to David was, "It's okay, you'll get the iPad soon. Do you want the iPad?" Nothing ever did leap out at us. Nor did I hear anything except the rushing of the wind and the occasional running stream by the trailside. I was so out of it that even in the car, I kept checking the back seat to see if there was something sitting behind us, ready to kill us. I don't know how to explain to David's pediatrician what happened in Mount Rainier. I haven't even told his mother the full story, only that I thought someone came up to our tent and that I had to fire a warning shot. Needless to say, David hasn't been the same since. He has been getting constant headaches, which might be from the damage to his ears by the gunshot. I don't really know how to end this story, but one thing is for certain. Never, ever take your kids out to Mount Rainier National Park. Driving through the backwoods of eastern Kentucky in the dead of night is the most terrifying thing I've ever done. Anyone who's ever been in the area knows exactly what I'm talking about. All the light from the moon and the stars is blocked by thick vegetation and hills. It's completely dark. There's history in those hills. A lot of history. And this energy fills the place with this crazy bad vibe. It's like the very land is mad at you. Like it wants you dead. The roads aren't well traveled, and you'll be hard-pressed to see a single car driving down them at night. Cell service out there, at least for me, spotty at best, non-existent at worst. And you pray to whatever you believe in that your car doesn't break down, knowing full well the folks who live smattered across the hills are isolated, private people, knowing that they wouldn't be very happy seeing you wandering onto their property in the dead of night. None too happy at all. It's what my mom calls bad country. She always told me to avoid the area if I could, saying that I'd likely be murdered or worse out there. And I've heard the stories too. Stories about people getting out of their cars to help a stranded motorist, only to be ambushed, robbed, kidnapped, and/or murdered. Stories about strange lights and ghost killers and vanishing hitchhikers and crazy inbred hillbilly families. There are said to be hundreds of unreported deaths out there. People just vanish off the face of the earth, never to be seen again. I've always avoided driving through those hills, but one night, I found myself driving straight down KY 52 South instead of I-75 South, straight into those hills, straight into that darkness. Around midnight, I got a message from my mom that my dad had been taken to the hospital and that his condition was serious. I immediately jumped out of bed and into my car, despite my mom telling me to wait until morning. I lived up in Richmond at the time, while my parents were down in Hazard. It's a little under a 2-hour drive via I-75 South, and a little over 2 via KY 52 South. That night, though, I-75 was closed due to an overnight bridge reconstruction project, so I had to take KY 52. I figured nothing would happen, that it'd be a smooth yet anxiety-ridden 2-hour-ish trip, but there was this dread I couldn't shake boiling up in my gut, urging me to wait until morning. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had to see my dad. I got from Richmond to Irving just fine, driving the windy road and hilly terrain with ease, going faster than the speed limit. It was from Irving to Jackson that things took a turn. First off, it was dark. Really dark. And even with my brights on, they still only barely lit up the surrounding area. The constantly curving roads didn't help either. I found myself slowing down, having to navigate through the dark, around the switchbacks and turns, inclines and depressions, hoping to God that I didn't run off the road or hit an oncoming vehicle. And the dread was at the forefront of everything now. Sure, it could have been exacerbated by worry for my father, but there was something about those hills, something evil, and I'm not ashamed to admit I was really afraid. The radio was dipping in and out, so I put in a CD to try and drown out my fear with music, but after the first song, I turned off the stereo completely and drove in silence, all of my senses on high alert. It felt wrong. It felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I would see a light flash in the woods, like a campfire but brighter. And I swear at one point between Crystal and Beattyville, there was this pale, hairless, large humanoid running after my car next to the road. I swear I saw it in the rearview mirror. It disappeared into the darkness and trees when I braked and spun around in my seat. 30 minutes out of Beattyville, I saw a child. He was wearing a yellow shirt, blue shorts, and a red jacket, with his hood up, colors that reminded me of Superman. He wasn't wearing any shoes. That bothered me. I turned off my brights and slowed my car to a crawl, wondering what the hell this kid, who appeared to be under 10 years old, was doing out in the middle of nowhere. I made sure my doors were locked, cracked my window, and asked him if he was okay as I rolled over to him. He didn't respond. I glanced down at my phone. No service. I asked him again if he was okay, and he looked up at me quickly, making his hood fall down. He was crying. I slowed my car to a stop and he immediately ran over, sticking dirty fingers into the cracks of my window, pounding on the door. He was screaming something about how they were hunting him, and that they were going to let the monster eat him, and they were watching us right now, waiting, just beyond the darkness. At this point, I was freaking out, and I might have even been screaming too, I just can't really remember. I tried to roll my window up while trying to not hurt the child, but he wouldn't release his grip on my window. I think he was trying to break it. A bright light flashed onto us and the kid screamed even louder. He let go of my car and began running down the road, back towards Birrittella. And I'm ashamed to say I took off. I was afraid I was going to die and become another statistic of these hills. In my rearview mirror, I watched as what looked like 3 men in hooded robes run out onto the road. The spotlight one of them was holding was trained onto my car and hit my mirror at an angle that blinded me, but it looked like the other 2 were going after the kid. I blinked and looked back towards the road, speeding like a bat out of hell. I pulled off in Jackson and drove straight to the police station. 2 detectives and an FBI agent who happened to be in the town working with a liaison listened to me with grave faces. When I was finished, the agent thanked me and then told me that a kid in town had gone missing the day before, from a Bible camp near the Kentucky River. He said that's why he's in town in the first place. Apparently, the kid and his friends were out playing hide and seek in the woods in broad daylight, when he just disappeared. He was wearing yellow, blue, and red, like Superman. The strange thing is, his footsteps just stopped, and his shoes were still there. It was like he was lifted off the ground by air. It was weird. Half a dozen cop cars with twice as many cops, the agent, and a search and rescue team were dispatched to the area within minutes of me reporting what I had seen. I drove to a local diner and ended up staying at Jackson until morning, making the 40-ish minute drive to Hazard after the sun rose. After hearing why it took me so long to get down there, my mom was beside herself with worry, but was also glad I was safe. My father ended up making a full recovery. If you're wondering if I do feel like a coward, if I regret not letting that kid get into my car, the answer is a resounding yes. I do. I am. It haunts me to this day. But I don't know what would have happened if I stayed there any longer. And I don't know if either of us would have made it out alive. No trace of that kid was ever found again. A single day added onto my sentence meant the difference between a normal jail and the unending nightmare of Pembina Prison. I was supposed to get 364 days. That was the deal. But the judge didn't like my attitude, whatever the hell that meant. So he made it 365. Boom. 1 year was the minimum for prison. My lawyer made a stink and a half, but it didn't do any good. It's not his fault. In fact, he's the one who's going to release this statement to the press, or leak it online if the Guardian Corrections group tries to get an injunction on us. People have to know what happened at Pembina Prison. I'm going to put it right out there and tell you that it was haunted. You think I'm joking, nuts, or lying, but you have no idea. Haunted prisons aren't anything like you imagine. Those places that advertise themselves and give people tours are sick jokes compared to the real thing. It got so bad that you can actually look up GCG's official filings for Chapter 11. That shit put them out of business on their very first prison. And right there on the briefs, using an early statute of North Dakota law from 1857 to file an insurance claim, it says, "Site of Pembina Prison confirmed by Governor's Office and 2 notary publics witnessing in person, to be afflicted by the supernatural such that continued business is impossible." It wasn't the first time the prison was closed for that reason either. But leeches kept buying it, and reopening it hoping to make a quick buck off the common man. And I was shoved into that hellhole without knowing the history even a single bit. Don't get me wrong, the building itself wasn't so bad, especially for something straight out of 1853. It was a large stone cube that was squat, heavy, and cramped, but way less sealed off than modern prisons. We could see a lot of the cells around us. There was only one main hallway per floor, and we were close enough to pass things between the bars and have some real human interaction. It could have been worse. There were 5 floors and capacity for 500 prisoners. When I first got there, I had a bunch of cellmates, and I heard there were 2,000 guys locked up, and I believed it. But that soon changed. I didn't talk to anyone for the first 3 weeks. I had never been to real prison before, and I was messed up over it. I didn't want to accept that I would be in that place and stuck with 3 other guys in my cell for an entire year. The whole prison seemed full of feral men. The bottom floor would start screaming and hollering and panicking in the middle of the night all at once. We were on the top floor, but we could hear their screams echoing through that open old layout like they were right next to us. I just thought the prisoners on the bottom floor were all nuts, until the guards weren't there to wake us up the first day of my 4th week. When I woke up in my corner without some guard banging on the bars of our cells, I finally had to talk. I asked one of my cellmates, Dante, what was going on, and I'll never forget the fear in his voice as he said something that should have made us all incredibly happy.
The guards are all gone, man.
The prisoners were talking quietly between the cells, and loudly between the floors through various whispers and shouts. But the most we could figure out was that something on the first floor had made them all quiet in protest. Sure, must have been the crazies screaming like that during the night, right? Except none of us could get any word from the bottom floor. It was dead silent down there. The guys on the second called out for hours. Someone was down there, they said, because they could hear shuffling footsteps walking around at random every so often. But whoever it was never said a single word. That was the first time Dante mentioned the crazy stories from the first floor. He muttered that he hoped none of that was true. But when I asked him about it, he just shook his head.
Nothing, man. None of it ever made any sense.
We were a little worried as the day wore on and nobody came to let us out for breakfast. And then nobody came to let us out for lunch. The time we usually got to spend outside in the yard came and went, and people began getting restless. In the cell to our left, Dante's friend Will began telling the guys to pass the word that we should all calm down and start sharing any food we had holed away. I remember asking Dante, is it really that bad?
They've denied meals and yard time for a day or 2 before,
he told me. But the other 2 guys in our cell didn't look convinced. One of them said,
"But not like this. They made damn sure we knew what we did. They never just up and left before."
Someone then handed us pieces of crusty old bread through the bars. It was much appreciated. The new guards didn't show up for another full day. We got plenty of yard time that day from these new guys, but they seemed more confused than us. We all watched from a distance as Will asked the guard about what had happened. The guard shrugged.
I don't know. GCG was paying a premium for fast hires, so I signed up.
"What about the other prisoners on the first floor?" Will asked. "We could hear them shuffling around down there. We looked on the way out to the yard, but we couldn't see anyone."
Huh. The guard frowned.
Nobody in there. They all got transferred.
Transferred? The hell's that mean?
It means DOCR took them back. Returned to state custody since the company couldn't handle them.
That made sense. If the floor had been full of nut jobs, then North Dakota's first local private prison company hardly had the experience to handle them. But these new guys didn't even have the skills to handle us. There were half as many guards as before, and they didn't know the routines or who was the dangerous ones among us. As a result, they were distant, scared, and forceful. All except one guy, Kellen. Kellen wasn't the first guard to treat us like human beings, but by then he was the only one around. He traded jokes while in the yard, never hit us, and looked us in the eyes when he talked. He went and found some paperwork to confirm the crazies had actually been transferred, but it took 3 months to get that info out of GCG. By the time he told us he had heard back, we had sort of forgotten the whole thing. 2 nights later, maybe 2 hours past lights out, the guys on the second floor began screaming. Dante leapt up and fell onto one of our cellmates by accident before shouting,
"Shit, must be a fire."
Other guys in our row began banging on the bars and shouting for the guards, but the uniforms charged past and headed downstairs without talking to us. We could hear them shouting orders from down below, and then yelling in confusion. The prisoners' screams were clearer coming from the second, and it sounded like they were terrified of something in particular, and wanted help. The sounds of gates being slammed and people running reached us after about 10 minutes of shouting, and then it was silent. We sat in the dark, waiting and listening until morning. When the new shift came in, they were surprised and confused, and Kellen came by to ask what had happened. We told him what we knew, but he had shown up and found open gates and an empty second floor. There was no indication what had happened, but he promised to check with corporate and figure out if the absent prisoners had all been rapidly transferred again. Dante gripped the bars and made sure Kellen was looking at him.
"Please, find out who the hell is walking around down there at night."
Kellen blinked at that.
"I mean, I'm the day shift, so I don't know what I could do, but what do you mean?" "The prisoners are gone,"
Dante told him fiercely but quietly.
"But the guys on the third floor said they still hear someone, maybe 2 or 3 someones, shuffling their feet every hour or so until morning."
"I guess I could go look right now." Dante reached through the bars and grabbed his uniform, something which usually warranted a beating.
"Listen, do not go down there by yourself. Stay in the stairwell unless someone's there with you."
Kellen nodded fearfully. It looked like he finally understood how spooked we were. He waved another guard off and Dante let go. But nothing more came of it for a whole season. The night shift had quit, and more guards got hired at an even higher pay. Kellen and another uniform scoped out the first 2 floors, but found nothing. Dante thought it was because they were looking during the day, but he wasn't about to ask our only friend to risk himself. It was maybe 3 months later. Yeah, I was halfway through my sentence, and I had taken up drawing, so I had a pen and paper, when we woke up in the middle of the night to everyone on the 3rd floor screaming in absolute panic. This time, we were less scared during the event itself. Will offered a guard racing past $500 from his commissary account if the man would come back and tell him what was going on. Dante listened intently, trying to hear individual screams coming from the 3rd floor over everyone else's shouting and confusion. I wrote down any words he thought he heard. What I wrote down: Jesus Christ, killing him, God, let us out, coming this way. We weren't as scared when it was happening because we had lived through it twice before, but this time, the long-term fear was much deeper. Now, we knew for sure that it was going to happen again, and any prisoners that had the means began lawyering up and doing everything they could to transfer to other prisons, even if it meant worse conditions. The problem was, the North Dakota prison system was already overflowing, which was the whole reason GCG got started in the first place. So every guy that got out meant it was much harder for the rest of us. Both of our cellmates transferred, giving us more space, so that was nice, but it was small consolation.
Apparently, word had started to spread on the outside, and GCG's solution, instead of paying the guards even more, was to stop having a night shift at all except for just one poor guy. Kellen was a bit miffed that he hadn't gotten a raise out of the whole thing, but he was starting to believe us that something was going on. By then, he had been around a while, and he knew we weren't bullshitters. And too many other prisoners had told them they had heard someone walking around on the first, second, and third floors at random during the night. It was just a few steps, sometimes as many as 20, but it only happened every so often, and only once it had been long enough that you thought it had finally stopped for good. One guy on the 4th floor said he heard a full run from one end of the 3rd floor hallway to the other, clear enough that he expected a guard to come charging up the stairwell, but nobody appeared. He bashed his skull on the prison walls and got transferred out on medical leave the next day, so we took him seriously. And that was enough to get Kellen to start doing some research on the outside. He came to us in the 7th month of my sentence with a pale face. Beside us at the bars, Will asked, "What's the word?" Kellen seemed grim. "A lot of bullshit out there, but this place is mentioned a lot. It's been closed before, but I keep getting stonewalled when I ask for the historical documents. Thing is, I don't think the prison itself is the problem. Get this." He pulled out a notepad for reference. 2 Canadian priests, Fathers Norbert Preventure and Sever Dumoulin, visited Pembina in 1818, before it was even an official township. That was back when the Hudson's Bay Company was big around these parts. That's how long ago it was. Pembina was the biggest town in North Dakota then, so the trading post was full at the time. So the priests chose to sleep outside where the Pembina River meets the Red River. The folktale has it that the vision of a rotting woman came in the night and stole Preventure's life. The 2 men bartered with her to split the remaining life between them, consigning both to live only 35 more years instead of the 70 Sever had left. Sever got an extra month and 20 days as a gift from his friend for his sacrifice. Kellen paused as if we might guess the obvious outcome. They both died 35 years later. I knew Pembina Prison had a horrible problem, but that didn't mean I had to believe everything. Let me guess, a month and 20 days apart. Kellen nodded. Dante snorted. "It's true, man," Kellen insisted. "The dates of death are right there on the Wikipedia. But get this, 35 years after 1818 made their death year 1853, the year this prison was built. And the place they camped that night? By the meeting of the rivers?" I wasn't sure what it meant, but I was beginning to feel very uneasy. "It's here, isn't it?" He was dead serious. "I think there's something here. Something ancient. I asked a guy I know, he's got Chippewa relatives over at Turtle Mountain. They know the history of Red River better than anyone else. He said his uncle told him never to sleep at the meeting of Red River and Pembina River. He said something lives there, under the ground, and awakens with the changing of the seasons." We were silent for a beat after that. It was folktale nonsense, but it was as good a theory as any. Whatever it was going to come back. And it wasn't friendly. Will talked to Kellen for another few minutes, but Dante was silent. After he was gone, I asked him what was wrong. He sat on one of the now unused bunks and told me, "I got another 5 years in here, and I ain't got no money for a lawyer. Your sentence will be up before it reaches us, and I'll be here alone." Will it? There was no way to be sure. It'll be back in 2 months for the 4th floor, and then 3 months after that for us. I could get out a week before or a day too late. It doesn't seem to be exact. He simply stared at the floor. "What I mean is, I do hope you get out before it comes." "Oh," I replied. I wasn't sure what else to say after that, so I just sat in my corner like I always did. It wasn't too much after that we heard GCG was going under. The mad rush of transfers had pissed off the state and lost the company a vital contract for a second location, and investors had pulled out or something. The number of guards was cut, then slashed, and Kellen took a pay hit to stay on as the only guard on the day shift. "There's only 2 prisoners left on the 4th floor," he told the 20 of us remaining as the general week we expected it to happen approached. "I feel like I should stay late just to see what the hell is going on down there. But the former guards I asked about it are all terrified as hell and refuse to talk. Some even got violent just because I asked." "It's cool," Will told him. "You got a kid at home. Don't be here for it." The 20 of us left on the 5th floor sat in our cells once night fell, praying and listening. On Monday night, nothing happened. The 2 guys down below occasionally shouted up to us that everything was clear. On Tuesday night, nothing happened. The strain was growing though, and we could sometimes hear them breathing rapidly down there. I could only imagine the adrenaline rushing through them every minute until dawn. On Wednesday night, nothing happened. Yet, something had changed in the air. The prison was much quieter now that 2,000 men had become 22, and I thought I could feel a subtle sort of heartbeat in the air, pounding against reality like it was a thin sheet of paper.
"It's just your imagination,"
Dante whispered. None of us were willing to speak any louder than that. On Thursday night, the heartbeat became a feeling of footsteps, approaching from a great distance. "Guys?" Will shouted from his cell. "You good down there?"
"Still here,"
one responded from down below.
"but I can feel it. It's at the door. It's knocking."
"The hell's that supposed to mean?" But the voice from below did not respond. Friday night. That was the night it would happen. All day, the 2 guys on the 4th floor pulled and clanged at their bars, begging to be let out. Kellen was torn. After 2 hours of listening to that pleading, he came up with an idea and transferred both of them up to our floor.
"If nobody's on 4, then we'll all be safe, right?"
Out loud, we agreed, but we were kidding ourselves. When the night guard showed up, he freaked and took the 2 men back down. He said out loud what we were all thinking.
"If nobody's on 4, then it'll just come right to 5 and get us all. What the hell was Kellen thinking?"
We had to listen to hours of sobbing that evening. It was the hardest trial of my life. I wanted to call out to the night guard. I wanted to ask him to get those men out of there. But if I did, I knew whatever was coming would find all of us instead. The moment it happened was like a cold hand on my shoulder.
"What's going on down there?"
Dante shouted. The man who was not sobbing called back.
It's changing,"
Will demanded.
"What's happening? Tell us." "It's red."
"Red?
"It's red."
What's red?" Will yelled insistently.
"God damn it, what's red?"
We stared down the hallway at the night guard, who stood listening in fear. The screaming began a few seconds later. This time, only 1 floor above, we could clearly hear every word. The sobbing prisoner shrieked.
"There! It's there!"
The man who had been communicating with us incoherently began raging with fear against his bars. Then, strangely, he stopped. The 20 of us clung to our bars, unable to help, unable to flee. Many of us cried, but we were otherwise silent. For to yell would be to drown out the last words of the men below. But they were eerily quiet for nearly 2 hours. We waited in strange silence as random footsteps traversed the 4th floor every so often. What was happening? For the first time, the victims of whatever was going on down below had chosen to be quiet instead of yelling for help. Why would that make things different? At long last, the sobbing man broke the silence.
"Oh my God, it's coming your way." "Shut up. It'll see you. Distracted. Hit the bars."
The sound of clanging echoed up the stairwell. The sobbing man said with terror,
It knows. It knows. Jesus Christ, do something."
We were no longer silent. We echoed that sentiment, loudly and repeatedly to the guard. Do something. He just stood there, literally quaking in his boots. Will shouted at him.
"Snap out of it. The other guards and prisoners got away. You can too. Whatever it is, it won't follow you if you let them out and leave."
Then I chimed in. They're gonna die down there. Dante threw his shoe and the impact finally snapped the man out of his terror. The guard ran to the stairwell and descended. The first thing we heard him say was a taken aback, "Mary, Mother of Christ." The sobbing man spoke again. "Over here! For God's sake, please let us out!" The other prisoner wasn't talking for some reason. We could hear his gasping terror, but that too went quiet. Then we heard a buzzer, and all the gates on 4 slammed loudly open. The sounds of panting, running, and someone dragging something followed. The prison went silent. And just like that, we were alone again. The formerly crowded prison now felt terrifyingly large and empty with only 20 of us and no guards. That night, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from down below. I counted time as best I could. 40 minutes. Then someone took 3 steps out of a cell and into the hallway. An hour and 6 minutes. Someone ran 10 steps along the hallway and stopped abruptly. 28 minutes. The footsteps approached the stairwell, but then turned into a cell and went silent. The thing was, whoever it was sounded barefoot, and the starting and stopping locations did not match. Where they ended was often nowhere near where they began. By the time dawn came, we were scared into motionless, terrified silence, and it took Kellen's arrival for us to begin stirring again. With GCG in bankruptcy court, we no longer had a night guard at all. If it came for us, there would be nobody to let us out of our cells like everyone else. We hardly talked, hardly ate. Each passing day was a grain of sand falling through an hourglass marking our executions. Our fellows began confessing to crimes they hadn't even committed just to get transferred to Supermax out of state. The only option left. Well, that and the other option. One by one, Kellen escorted or dragged guys out of our floor. 20 became 15. Then 10. Then it was just me and Dante, with Will still in the cell to our left. The 3 of us and Kellen. 4 men awaiting doom. We sat playing card games in the weeks leading up to it. It would be 1 full year for me in that place, but I could swear I had spent a lifetime in that cell. I couldn't think, couldn't remember life before, couldn't imagine surviving after. Every day I prayed for a transfer to come in. But North Dakota had gotten sick of our shit, and the judges had stopped hearing cases from Pembina Prison. They didn't know there were only 3 of us left. Nobody knew. We contacted the media. We phoned the governor's office. We made a ruckus. That was probably worse than nobody knowing. Because it turned out, nobody cared. Also, there was nobody higher up at GCG following the situation, and Kellen couldn't get anybody on the phone. Payroll, meaning just his paycheck, was being handled by a third-party disbursement company that couldn't answer any questions about ongoing proceedings. The week approached. On Monday night, nothing happened. We were like statues in our cells, alone, waiting for a sign of the executioner's approach. When dawn came, we sighed and began moving again. Dante asked, "You get out Friday?" I nodded. If things went like the day before, I would be released the day of. As long as I left before sundown, I would be all right. On Tuesday night, nothing happened. 2 for 2. Just one more. Just one more day. I sat through that darkness until... No! The feeling of the prison had changed around us. A subtle heartbeat began to pulse against our faces and ears and eyes. It had come a day earlier in the week than last time. That morning, Will patted my arm as we both leaned out of the bars. "Sorry, man." Dante just shook his head angrily. I wasn't going to get out in time. On Wednesday night, the heartbeat became the sound of footsteps approaching from some unfathomable distance. I think I stood at the bars of our cell that entire day, fingers wrapped around metal with force to match the tension in the air, and in our minds. This couldn't happen. This wouldn't happen. My lawyer would walk in and tell me that he had gotten the judge's unfair addition of an extra day removed. One day. One goddamn day. Even if I had spent the whole year in this prison, One day still meant life or death. Let me out. Let me the hell out, for God's sake. But nobody cared, and nobody would listen. I'd like to tell you that Kellen stayed late that night. I'd like to tell you that when the entire floor began to glow red, the hallway, the cells, the stone itself, as whatever ungodly abomination in the earth, began to wake upon the changing of the season, as distant footsteps became a traveler at the door of our minds. I'd like to tell you that Kellen was there and hit the button and opened the gates to let us all out. I'd like to tell you that I didn't see anything, and that I'm not permanently a broken man. I didn't claw at the walls of my cell as it slowly approached, moving a few steps every 20 to 70 minutes. I'd like to tell you that all three of us were able to run away and escape that horror upon reality, with its rotting hands and blind eyes radiating crimson light as it searched for us at random. But I can't give you a satisfying end to this story. The disbursement company fired Kellen and changed the locks on the property. According to their paperwork, all the prisoners had been moved, and they thought he had been getting paid for guarding an empty prison. They left us in there for 11 days before the error was found, which meant 11 nights with that thing. For 11 days we starved. For 11 nights we sat absolutely still, not daring to move or breathe or even look left or right. It knew where we were generally. It stood right outside of our cells for hours, and sometimes walked right through the bars and grasped at the beds around us, daring us to make even the slightest motion. When you've spent 6 hours staring into the blind crimson eyes of a rotting demon, unable to blink your eyes for fear that it will hear the air your lashes move, when you've seen what it's seen, the worlds it has walked reflected in hellish red, will you understand? But no one cares. I'd like to tell you that I wasn't traumatized by the hell I went through being left to rot, and left to die as nothing more than a number on some corporation's books. But no one cares.
I don't really know what I was thinking when I bought the plush monkey that could talk and gave it to my 6-year-old other than I wanted the boy to cause a ruckus in my house. He pushed the button on the back so many times that I memorized the 4 factory phrases. Ooh ah ah, gimme a banana, a Wilhelm-esque scream, and a Tarzan yell. I thanked God when the batteries finally died on the damn thing. The most amazing thing was that my son did not come crying to me to replace the batteries, seeming content to just drop it and walk away. When I stooped down to pick up the plush animal to put it back in the toy bucket, the tiny speaker in the hard plastic box warbled.
Do you remember when I used to be your son?
I immediately dropped the monkey on the floor. I poked it with my foot once before picking it back up. I pushed the button on the back. Nothing. Still, I was sure I heard it say those words. I called my son over to me and asked him if he ever heard the monkey say anything weird or unusual. That's when the boy's face lit up with fear and excitement, as if I had uncovered something he had been wanting to tell me for a while. My son took the monkey into the laundry room and turned on the dryer, putting the monkey on top of it, so he can't hear us. He wouldn't say a word until he led me outside. I had never seen him like this before. When we were standing out in the backyard, the boy said, "Sometimes it says very bad things to me. It says it wants to hurt us. I was too scared to talk to you. Not when it could hear us. You have to break it. You have to go in there and smash it." I wanted my son to learn patience and logic at a young age, and that meant not destroying an inanimate object because of fear. I explained that we both heard a voice that was someone at the factory playing a prank on us, and we might need it for evidence. But the fear in my kid's eyes and words made it clear that this wasn't a matter for the courts. When we opened the door to the laundry room, the monkey had moved from the top of the dryer to the bottom of the door, My son shrieked, even as I tried to explain that it just fell off the dryer because it was shaking. That's when the monkey eked out a long, drawn-out, moaning cry like nothing we've ever heard before. My son shouted for me to stop it. The lower part of my brain kicked in. I brought my booted foot down on the plastic box inside the monkey, crushing it against the laundry room's concrete floor. Something reddish black. Not blood, not oil, but something pungently organic and toxic leaked out from the seams of the plush monkey. You know, you should have listened to your son. Now you are alone, a voice said behind me. I swear, I turned to see something large and old, like the last orange ember of a once great fire sparking just behind my son's innocent eyes. The boy turned and bolted towards the front door, running faster than I ever could. The thing that hid inside the monkey controlled my son's body like a champion, rocketing him into the darkness where the street lamps couldn't reach, cackling the kind of laugh that only comes from novel joy of having fresh lungs and new legs again. I never did see my son again. But on some nights, when it's quiet, I can still hear that laugh in the darkness. My normal shifts were during the day, 9 to 5 like most people. But on that day, we were short-handed on the night shift staff, because the last person who worked during those hours had just quit. We've been having a lot of people quit the night shift lately, so that meant I had to cover. Weirdly enough, I had never worked the graveyard shift before then, and I was actually kind of excited for it. I brought some coffee and a 5-hour energy with me because the hours ran from 10 to 5 a.m., and there was no way I'd make it that far naturally. I got to my tower right before 10 p.m., when it was already pitch black out, and the cold summer night had fully set in. The tower was fairly tall, with several flights of stairs leading up to the top. The entire thing was mostly surrounded by thick forests, except for the trail that I came in from, and a murky pond that was just to the right of one of the tower's legs. The pond itself was covered in those little lily pads, and had algae floating around the surface. It was actually somewhat large for a natural lagoon. I climbed up and all I could hear was the non-stop sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. When I hit the top, I fumbled with my keys until I finally found the right one and went inside. The singular room was small and square-shaped. 3 of the walls were mostly glass, and the other one was opaque and had the door that I just walked through. The roof went up like a pyramid for a short length until it peaked, and it was completely made out of wood. To my left was a nicely made bed, and a nightstand with a lamp and a flashlight on top. Not like I'd be using the bed, though. On the wall next to that was my CB radio and communication stand, which every one of those towers had. Next to that sat my refrigerator and microwave, which was part of a small kitchen that extended to the other wall as well. Inside the kitchen section on the right wall were several cabinets. Some were small ones that held snacks and some canned foods, and another set of large cabinets that I couldn't open for some reason, which likely had vacuums and other cleaning supplies that were above my pay grade. Overall, the tower was roomy. I went over to the communication stand and did my standard check to make sure everything was working properly. I called into the ranger station channel and said, "Well, Donnie, it looks like it's just you and me tonight." Donnie didn't say anything back, so I figured he was just using the bathroom. I went and grabbed the flashlight on the stand and reached into one of its drawers,
pulling out a set of binoculars from it. I made my way out onto the balcony and checked to make sure there were no fire hazards or any other kind of dangerous things over there. Once I checked that box off of my to-do list, I headed back inside and pulled out the chair from the communication stand and put it by one of the glass walls. I grabbed a granola bar from one of the kitchen cabinets to munch on. I sat down and put the binoculars up to my eyes and looked over the surrounding forest. It didn't seem like any animals were up and about, and no birds were in the sky either. I skimmed over a couple of clearings to make sure that no teenagers were off camping illegally. Then I went and peeked over at the far ridge, where I saw a snowman standing alone in the gap of the trees. Wait a second. It was summer. I turned back again to see it wasn't a snowman, but some kid in a ghost costume. It looked like the ones from Charlie Brown, with the big black holes for eyes that looked more like they were colored black than actually holes. The kid was still, and was staring right into my direction, unmoving. I couldn't see the kid's parents anywhere, and by now it was rolling up on 11 o'clock, so that meant something was off. I broke contact with the kid and walked over to the radio, calling into the station. Donnie, you out of the bathroom yet?
Barely made it out, but I'm here.
I chuckled. Donnie was always good for a laugh. Hey, there's some kid with a blanket walking around in the southeast sector. They look alone.
A blanket? What the hell are you talking about?
I think it's a costume. It's one of those ghost things. It's got black holes for eyes and stuff.
You mean like Charlie Brown?
Yeah, can you check it out?
Alright, I'll go check it out. I'll call in on the walkie-talkie to tell you what I see.
Alright, copy that. I turned off the radio and crossed over to the nightstand, grabbing the walkie-talkie. Once I had it, I sat back down on the chair and put the binoculars up to my eyes, zooming in to where the kid was. The ridge was empty. No kid in sight, which I knew would make this 1,000 times harder. I pulled up the antenna on the walkie-talkie and dialed to the right channel. Donnie, you hear me?
Yeah, I hear ya. I'm getting close to the sector now. I'm heading up to a ridge for a vantage point.
Perfect, that's where I saw the kid. But I think they have moved since then.
Well, I'll just check around and see if I can find anything.
I watched as Donnie came over the ridge waving his flashlight around in the dark, until he looked towards the tower and shrugged.
Nothing over here.
Damn, hopefully he turns up again. Until then, I'll just notify the police and check with any missing reports.
Alright, I'll go back to...
Donnie's voice cut out and I saw his flashlight turn off in the distance. The small illuminated spot where he stood was swallowed by darkness. Donnie? You there? I heard no response. I rushed outside the door and around the corner to where I saw him. I hollered his name only to hear my voice echo back from the woods. And that's when it hit me. There wasn't a single other sound in the entire forest. The crickets and frogs had stopped chirping and croaking. The wind didn't rustle through the leaves. Everything was at a standstill. I could hear my heartbeat throbbing in my ears and nothing else. I moved my flashlight around the woods in some futile attempt to find him. I was getting into that state of mind where I was so nervous that my throat started to close up, and if I moved, I felt like something very bad would happen. I had to do something. I turned around, and as I did, I glanced at the stairs below me. At the very bottom stood a skinny, horrifically angled woman. She was tall, dripping with water, with black hair and dark, murky blue skin that stretched across her bent and broken bones. Her gray dress was shredded, and her black shoes were muddy and wet. And her face.
Her eyes were milky white, and her mouth hung open like a snake, like her jaw had been grossly broken. She let out a blood-curdling and ear-piercing scream of agony and began to shuffle up the stairs fast. When I saw this, I snapped out of my fear, and I ran back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. There was no way she could run that fast, even if all of her bones weren't broken in the wrong directions. I ran back into the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find. And then I pulled out the walkie-talkie again, screaming into it. "Donnie, where are you? Is anybody there?" Then, I heard the creaking of a door. I slowly turned, and I froze when I saw what was there. The door to the tower was still there, locked and shut, and had been completely undisturbed. What scared me was the giant cabinet that now stood open, with a kid dressed like a Charlie Brown ghost standing just in front of it. I stood there, unmoving until I heard him giggle. I recognized that giggle. I grabbed the sheet and ripped it off of one of Donnie's kids, Marvin, sporting a smirk and a walkie-talkie. "Dad, Joey, I got him."
Ha ha ha! Pissed his pants just like I said he would, right?
Donnie and his other son laughed from the other side of the walkie. I was mad, but glad that I wasn't about to get murdered in this tower. I grabbed his walkie-talkie and fired back. More like pissed me off is what you did. I hope you're happy.
Hearing you scream like a little girl sure did make me happy.
Yeah, screw you too, buddy. That wasn't even me. That was your stupid zombie chick. Who was that, your wife?
My what? Does the ghost look like a zombie from that far away? You said it yourself, it looked like Charlie Brown.
Not the ghost, man. The woman on the stairs. She screamed and ran up them so that she could scare me into the tower. Hell, she must have been an Olympic runner.
Yeah, I didn't put any woman on the stairs.
Upon hearing that, I quit the next morning, and I vowed never to return to that forest again.